Kia ora koutou katoa T3 community. Welcome to another Territory 3 webinar in the Territory 3 Academy series. And this is quite surreal. I'm welcoming today Sian Simpson. The roles have turned. It's quite ironic. Welcome, Sian.
Hello, thanks.
We've been trying to organise this for some time, and it has a deep connection to Territory 3, obviously, in terms of me being enlightened around the concept of community early in the days of Kiwi Landing Pad, now reimagined as Territory 3. So really looking forward to this session. I'm going to ask Sian in a minute just to say hi and tell folks what she's been up to recently, although I think most of you know. And then we'll get into a bit of a community overview, and then we'll have time for questions and a bit more of a deep dive around the things that you want to know around community as founders and folks in the tech ecosystem. Firstly, before we do that, a big shout out to our sponsors, Bank of New Zealand, New Zealand Trade Enterprise, K1W1, Evander Investments, Jasmine Investments, and Amazon Web Services. We wouldn't be coming to you without them. Thank you very much. And again, we are on Zoom. So for those of you not familiar with the format, which would be very few of us nowadays, you can make comments in the chat, but if you do have a specific question, we'd love you just to put that in the Q&A so that we can make sure we get through all of the questions before the end of our time together. So on that note, Sian, welcome. Be great to hear a bit about what you've been up to and then take us through what community is.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, John. It is quite funny being back here. I feel like I kind of grew up with the Kiwi Landing Pad with many of you, and now find myself back here talking about the thing that I learned the most about at Kiwi Landing Pad, or Territory 3 now. So yeah, I thought today we would just talk a little bit about how I see community, a bit of an education at a more basic level that I take pretty much everyone through, just to get everyone on the same page, and then we can get us into some more like technical stuff if that's what you're looking for and whatnot. And as for what I've been doing since I left Kiwi Landing Pad, I mean, it was the middle of lockdown when I started Public Rally. I really drilled into, you know, what did I really like about my job at Kiwi Landing Pad, and there were sort of two bits that really stood out to me as things that really sort of fueled my fire, and one was the community building, community strategy element that I think that I kind of realized I was pretty good at, and then also that sort of big content program development. And I think it's no secret that I really like content in all the different forms and how it can work within your various strategies. And so started Public Rally, which is an agency dedicated to building world-class communities and content programs. Worked with a whole bunch of people during that time. It's been pretty fun. I don't really do any marketing because it's all inbound, which I guess is quite lucky. And you know, get to work with some of the coolest brands all over the world, with many companies from New Zealand, including both departments at the New Zealand government, which I didn't think would happen. But there we go. Also work with quite a few venture funds as well. So case in point, worked with, you know, lots of people. So getting into it, I think community is who, not what. It's people coming together around a shared purpose, interest, or goal, as a bit of a definition. But I think what's new about community building is, or community is driving business value through it for positive impact. And I would almost say it's like a new business model. I think for so long we've seen, you know, product-led growth or sales-led growth. And I think we're starting to see community-led growth as a bit of a strategy around, you know, how do you get those network effects in your business or whatever it is that you're trying to do. So this is something new that I've been doing to kind of get people into the mindset of like, what is community and why does it matter, and how does it work? So if you consider these groups, right, you've got people who ride bikes. So I think John and I would fall into that category. Then you've got people who ride racing bikes.
Definitely not.
Definitely don't fall into that category. Then you've got people who ride racing bikes and compete. People who ride racing bikes and compete in Austin, Texas. And then you've got people who ride racing bikes and compete in Austin, Texas and have children. So I guess the whole point of this is we tend to overcomplicate the definition of community. It's just a group of people, but all groups have a shared identity or they wouldn't be that group. And some groups have a shared identity that is more meaningful to its members and some less so. So the fact that John and I both ride bikes maybe not as meaningful. People who do that bottom layer or the bottom 2 layers, like maybe that is more meaningful, and that's where you start to get that sort of meaningful connection, which is what you're looking for in community building. So I guess we're all human beings, you know, that is our shared identity. But what you're looking for is that, you know, is this grouping meaningful to people? And that's, you know, you're starting to ask the right question as you get into that. So when I'm doing my community strategy or building out communities for people, I guess this is what I'm trying to figure out, is the sort of magic equation. So the value exchange has to be one where we give something in exchange for something else. And what they get is something, 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 and belonging. And so as you go through building your community, you know, you might do a bunch of activities with people, and then that in turn, like, gives them belonging, which is non-negotiable, but it's also the reason why they're there. And it's the reason why they're there with you. And I think what's really important about this is that if there's no value exchange, I don't think you can have a community, because it becomes self-serving and self-interested. And I think brands that try to build community that is self-serving and out of self-interest, and there's nothing really in it for the community members know that, and it's not authentic. And so therefore, I don't think the community will succeed. You know, there always has to be a value exchange. And I think this is one of the biggest things you have to get your head around as a company. You know, if you've got acquisition targets or revenue goals or all of those things, sometimes the community in the short term won't meet any of those things, but it's because you've got to play more of a long-term game, because trust and credibility is built over time. What should we do about the people who are raising their hands, John?
Well, we don't really have a raising hands sort of format per se, but perhaps if you have your hands raised, you might want to put whatever it is you want to ask into the Q&A. That's probably the easiest way of doing that.
Awesome. So I'll keep going. I guess if we just look at the role of community and why community, many businesses launch communities to flatten the adoption curve for their new product or service offering. And these types of communities create an environment for connections and conversations. They usually center around content forums and other resources that make it easier for people to learn, share ideas, and get advice. I guess Territory 3 is a classic example of that. A community can also provide a way for participants to leverage what others have done to build new things or improve what others have built. And also, I guess this is the belonging part, make the journey less lonely along the way. And I think that was for a long time why, you know, a lot of people belonged to Territory 3 or Kiwi Landing Pad, was because building a business is fucking hard, and scaling a business is hard, whether you're a founder or, you know, a director of marketing or even, you know, just in the team. Like, it's a really long journey, it's a hard journey, and a lot of the time you don't really know what you're doing. And so that sort of building with people becomes really important. And that's not just akin to founders, it's the same as, you know, I'm building a in-house legal community at the moment, and they have exactly the same issue. You know, they're dealing with all of this business complexity and trying to manage risk, and then they want to talk to other people like them, because they're like, this is hard and I want to know how other people are solving these problems. So we look at implementing stages of community, the sort of 8 stages. You've got your community, why you should build it, what you should build, maybe getting some inspiration of different types of community, which I'll get into soon. Then you have your community purpose. Now, your community purpose is aligned to your business purpose, but it's not the same as your business purpose. And so sometimes this trips people up because they want them to be the same thing, but they're not. You know, your community is there to serve the purpose and mission of the community and not the other way around. So then you have the space of where it lives. You've got how it integrates externally with your external environment, but also kind of internally within your business, and where does the community team or community person sit within your organization. Number 5 is discovery and growth. So how do we find more community members and get them into the community funnel? Number 6 is taking a closer look at your members, maybe their different types of personas and maybe your different segments, like what do they need, and can you have a community strategy that actually solves for different segments while still having an umbrella strategy for the whole lot. 7 is your community team, and obviously we're all in business, so you probably want to measure your community as well. So what metrics matter? So if we look at community purpose for a second, a great purpose statement will answer, why do we exist? What problem are we solving? What value are we creating? How are we solving that problem and creating that value, and who are we targeting? The community exists to solve X problem in Y way by doing Z with A people. And if that doesn't make sense, I have some examples. And I think some of you might have heard me talk about these before, so sorry about that if you're hearing it for the second time. So O2 is a telecommunications company in the UK, and their community purpose was to deflect from conventional customer service. And the goal was to inspire the community to create cost-effective or free content that will be used by other customers and chat reps. Now, the O2 community was millions of people, which is a lot. And the reason why a lot of the community members answered a lot of support tickets and whatnot was because they were incentivized with free credit. And I don't know, just being a bit of they found community around being a bit of a geek about, phone things. So those forums are pretty funny. Now, Airbnb is another one, which is interesting. Their purpose was to create better and more frequent hosts. And the goal was to work with the existing large community base to create content that will educate members on hosting. And so I think with Airbnb, it's interesting because a lot of people will go, well, it's a double-sided marketplace. So how do I know what community group to focus on? And maybe should I build two communities? And the answer to that, whilst it seems maybe not intuitive, is actually no, you should focus on the supply side, because without supply, you don't really have anything to buy. And so I guess if we look at these two examples of what purpose they're serving from a business perspective, O2's community was lowering the cost to serve. So it was a customer service sort of retention tool. And for Airbnb, it was actually a revenue driver. So the better the hosts are, the more that they host, the better experience that travelers have and guests when booking those experiences. So the more likely those guests are to come back to platform, which is quite an interesting way of looking at things. So I'm not looking at the chat right now, but I'll look at it once I'm done, which is soon. So types of community, you've got product, innovation, support, learning, membership, brand owned and hobbyist. A lot of these can overlap. I guess the point of this slide is really kind of saying like, well, what's the predominant focus that you want for your community? Do you need it to help the customer success team? Do you need to educate your users? Or are you trying to do more of a category creation play, like Gainsight did? And so then that might be more of a learning community or education community, bringing people into the pipe that way. I think what's also interesting about this is that there's certain communities that you wouldn't have depending on your business model. So for example, with the telecommunications company, it was completely fine to have a support community because you didn't have too many privacy issues with people's data and whatnot, because there was common fixes or tier 1 or tier 2 support that anyone could deploy. Whereas if you're a bank, you probably more be having a product or innovation community because of the privacy issues surrounding, people's data and information. You can't give that out. And so you're really looking at, well, what future products or innovation do our customers want versus like the support that they might need from the community. I often get asked what the difference between social and community, like social media and community management is. And so there's this little slide here. I think, for social media, the goal is linkage and conversation. For community networks, it's about accomplishing that community mission or purpose. Creator of social media is the company, and the creator of the community is actually the members. And that's when I think that you've got a true community. So type of conversation on social media is shallow and dispersed, whereas in the community network, it's focused and deep. And I think from a social media perspective, it's used for connection, whereas for your community network, it's used for control. A lot of the times when you're signing up to a community network, you have to agree to a set of rules and guidelines and almost like a way of being and why you're there, where there's less control with social media and probably less buy-in as well. So I pulled this off the internet from a community building friend of mine, and I think it's kind of pretty cool to crystallize the difference between building an audience and building a community. I think when we're building an audience, we're helping people, but the difference with building a community is that you're helping people help each other. So that peer-to-peer journey that people go on when they're in a community, it becomes so much more than just the people who are facilitating it. And that's when you know that, you know, your community is working, because it's got those network effects and that peer-to-peer connectivity in a many-to-many way that you're looking for. So I guess looking at, I like this community maturation model. It's a little bit geeky, but I think it really helps to describe the journey that you're about to go on if you are thinking about building community. So at the left end, you've got, you know, low trust and no collaboration. And at the high end, you've got high trust and direct collaboration. And I think as you go on your community journey, you're essentially looking to get to the right. So have high trust, you know, be innovating with your customers or community members and being directly collaborating with them. The other reason why I put this in here is just to kind of iterate that, or make it clear that community is a really long tail game, and that you're not just going to create it overnight. And if you do, kudos to you, but I don't, you know, it's not necessarily how it works. And so I think with Kiwi Landing Pad, this took us about 3 years to achieve. And so, you know, I'm able to achieve it slightly shorter now because I maybe know what I'm doing more, but also it's just like, it is a big investment. And if you want to do best by your community, you know, you have to invest in it for the long run. The other thing about this is kind of interesting is I like to talk about push and pulls with community building. So I think with gaming, you know, if anyone plays like games or The Sims like I do, which might be embarrassing, I describe those sorts of things as a push, because, you know, you play a game and then you push into a community to talk about the game. Maybe you need to know something. Whereas I think a lot of the communities we're creating in the business world, it's actually a pull. So giving people a place to come, like how are they going to get there? How are they going to find out about you? And then an environment where you can start talking and listening with those people. So then you can actually start doing stuff with those people. And that's sort of the journey you're looking to go on in the first few phases of your community build, which I'll talk about soon. So what makes a world-class community? So I think a few of the things that I like to look at is a strong engagement rate. So basically, you divide up all of your community activities and you give them a weight, and then you look at how many people in your community are actually participating in those activities and are they engaged or not. There should be high trust. I like the sort of more anecdotal or qualitative measure around they pick up the phone, email, or show up. And that was definitely one I used a lot when I was working at Landing Pad. There's a strong sense of belonging, helpfulness to others. They self-organize, so they're doing that sort of peer-to-peer connection stuff again. They have good network effects. They advocate for the brand of the business, and they build your moat. And I think, you know, we have friend Savvy, Savannah Peterson, who likes to say that community is your first defensible asset. And I totally agree with that once it's at that level where it is operating that way. So this is something that I learned at the Kiwi Landing Pad that John actually first drew for me. He was like, well, this is what you've done. It's like, well, thanks, John. Thanks for giving me my, you know, my... You
made the text a lot nicer in this one.
Yeah, and so, you know, this is my community canvas that I work with on all my clients and for every community that I build. And it kind of, I guess, riffs off all your normal like lean business canvases. Essentially what we're looking at is on the left, you have your community funnel. And I guess the entire goal of community is to get people into it and then to make them more engaged. That's what we're really doing. And how do you make them more engaged? Well, or how do you grow the community? That's everything to the right of your community funnel. So it might be content, courses, events, programs, and also maybe connections or partnerships with other people. It's like the API is how you connect in with those other people or groups or whatever it was. So at Kiwi Landing Pad, we obviously had a lot of connectivity with public-private partnerships with other people. Say if you're Xero, you might put your ecosystem in here. And I think the other thing to note with this canvas is, you know, you can put your whole strategy on this canvas. And I guess this is what you're trying to fill out in your discovery process when you're doing your community interviews or your research. You know, what content do our members want? What events will engage them? You know, do we need to do a peer-to-peer matching program or something like that? You actually find all of the information from your members. They will tell you everything that they need. And your job is sort of to deliver on that need whilst also getting what you need out of it as well. We can talk more about that soon. I think I lost my train of thought, but I'll keep going. Now, this is also something that we kind of came up with at Landing Pad, and it was something that I kind of learned really, and why community became so important to me, and why we actually started the webinar series in the first place, was because, you know, with Image A, we were doing our sales and marketing jams, and they were really loved and people liked them. But then they kind of said, well, the feedback in the survey said, well, this is great, but we only come together every 6 months and we want to learn continuously. And so how do we do that? And it was a bit of a light bulb moment for me, because I was like, well, if you look at Image B, I was like, well, how do we connect the lulls in activity and actually start connecting the community in the way that they want to be connected? And so that's why we started the webinar series. So we had a sustained program of activity, you know, every Thursday at 10 a.m, even though it's Tuesday. But then we also had our sales and marketing jams. And so I think what we often find is a hive of activity with groups of people in the vein of events, content, and otherwise, but there's nothing connecting the lulls in this activity, or joining the dots, as I like to call it. So as I mentioned, with Image A, you build all of this momentum with an event, gathering, or perhaps content, and then it dies again and you start at square one, which maybe isn't that smart. And then with Image B, you connect the lulls between the momentum with community, and this builds connection and also the ability to have a continuous learning journey, which builds capability and creates that virtuous circle of growth and connection without ever having to go back to square one.
It's interesting, because I think the first time we actually drew this diagram was in relation to software as a service, subscription renewals, and the fact that, you know, point A on the left was the traditional way. In my first business, we were looking at, you know, intensity around the customer. So the first peak was actually closing and selling, and then the second peak was renewal, and there was just kind of nothing in the middle in terms of nurturing and that sort of customer success journey. So I might come back to that in the Q&A, myself being selfish for a question about that link between customer success and community.
Yeah. So then I guess the other thing just to note is that the white space in Image B then becomes where the community can self-organize and create what they need together in a peer-to-peer capacity, which is when, as you, like I've mentioned, that you know that you have a true community. So if you bring it all together, and excuse my ugly drawing, but you're looking for sustained momentum, community connection, continuous learning, and capability building. You know, pushing up into those things, you have your events, your content, your programs, and intersection points that bring people together and create that momentum. And then your white spaces, you know, where people are self-organizing or maybe doing their one-to-one stuff that you no longer usually have to facilitate because they do that for themselves. So now I just have some sort of truisms that I feel like I kind of abide by, which is I believe that community can both be an acquisition tool and also a retention tool. And so this can be quite confusing when you're talking to executives and, you know, both your revenue officers, but also your customer success officers. You know, how can you use it to get people into the business? Maybe you're educating them before they're ready to buy. That could be one. You're creating a community around a certain role type that's a bit underserved. But then also as a retention tool, like what can you do with customers that are already engaged in your product, but maybe they want to talk to each other? And is that an opportunity for you to make them more sticky and retain them even further? So I guess with community, you have to find the hooks in your community strategy to make people want to come back continuously. And, you know, I've been going through this a little bit at the moment, but I think this one's actually coming up next. An example of this, I think, is, you know, these webinars. So the webinars for Kiwi Landing Pad became a really massive hook for getting people into the community, getting people to self-serve on information that they needed. And when they were ready, dropping out of that sort of webinar and education journey and into a, you know, I'm coming to America, or how do I expand my product, or who can you introduce me to in this area that can help me do X, Y, Z. So this one is a big one, which is your community strategy is a compound of a variety of activities, not one silver bullet rules them all. And I say this because I have a lot of communities that I build and people that I talk to, and they think that having a community platform is going to solve all of their problems, but the community platform is only one community activity in a sea of community activities. And so I would sort of just encourage you to be like, you know, go back to the canvas and look at, well, what is my community program of work and how does it weave together? And also just acknowledging that there's not one technology tool that's going to do all of your community building for you. there's sort of a suite of tools. It's just like you have a marketing stack, you kind of have a community stack. And I think people get a bit stuck trying to solve community with one platform or one activity, when actually it needs to be a combination of a few that your community really wants. You have to do the unscalable to scale. So when I was at Kiwi Landing Pad, I would send out, 50 messages in one go to get webinar guests in the hope that someone would say yes. And I had all of these lists, and then usually someone said yes, but what you guys didn't see was that I'd emailed 50 people to get that one guest. And so this is a email with someone that I was talking to the other day, which maybe I shouldn't share, but I just reached out to maybe 100 people to get them to come to my event. So I'm still doing stuff that doesn't scale, because I know that in the early days, that's how you build your biggest advocates. And I think the last thing on this is the number one rule of community. And I think I learned this at Landing Pad in the biggest way, is that it's non-negotiable for building, the number one rule of community for me is that it's non-negotiable as building trust, rapport, and credibility. You have to be 100% authentic. And then following that, you have to be consistent. Oh, there's one more. Okay, one more. Sorry, John. So then, I guess just to summarize all of this, like community at its core is just a group of people, and it becomes a community when you decide to do something more with them and that they and you deem mutually valuable. That's all I got.
Very cool. Very cool. Thank you. We had one question, but I think it relates from Helen just to whether she could have a copy of the slides.
I'll think about it.
Thanks for the question, Helen. I had a couple of questions, and folks, if you do have any questions, just fire them into the Q&A. Just harking back to that slide, it's bringing back a lot of memories for me in terms of building the landing pad community, which you obviously led marvelously. Tools, because I think one of the first things we found was like a traditional CRM just didn't cut it when you actually have that chasm that you want the community to start filling in by talking to each other. What are your thoughts on that, and what's available now?
I love community building because it's just, it's always, it depends, which is, great caveat. There are lots of tools available now, and I think the toolkit is really robust, and I think you can get, there's just so much available. I think CRM is still a niggly one, and that, we used Mobilize. I think it was great for getting calendar invites stuck in people's calendar that they can't remove, which maybe was a blessing of that whole webinar stickiness thing. Depending on whether or not you're doing a big build or a small build, what your price point and budget is, there's tools available for everything. So at the low end of town, I think you've got, your Mighty Networks, your Circle, Tribe, even Slack, Discord, social media groups, which all have pros and cons. And then at the top end of town, you've got, Salesforce, Trailblazers, just all of those. I think what's more interesting is actually like what the tools surrounding your key activity drivers. So for example, if peer-to-peer matching is a really important thing for your business and matchmaking your members, there's a new tool called Orbit AI, and they essentially do that matchmaking thing for you, which is brilliant. And it all works within your email flow. And so that for me rounded out my toolkit, because I was going on for years around how I just wanted to matchmake the community, but I wasn't good at pivot tables, so I couldn't figure out how to do it within Excel. Then there's more interesting stuff coming online around, there's a tool called Community, and essentially it's a phone number that your community can text you on, and then you can send out group messages on. And now there's some people that would actually work really well for. So hypothetically, if we use an example, say you've got a group of founders that are expanding to the US, and they text the Kiwi Landing Pad and being like, hey, John, do you know where I go for this? And you text back and you go, yeah, sure. And so I think what we're seeing in community land is these tools that facilitate those constant interactions that people actually want to have where they want to have them, rather than having to go back to platform to do certain things. So yeah, there's a bunch of tools, which is really exciting. And I think the community builder's job is figuring out how do they weave in together so that to the community member, it feels like a seamless experience.
That's very cool, and it seems to have provoked a lot more questions too. So a couple here from Grant Johnson. Thanks, Grant. He said it's really helpful. Thanks. And what would a community team look like in terms of roles and skills?
Yeah, so sorry about this, but again, it depends. But where did the question go?
Oh, sorry.
I've got it back. Really depends on what you're doing. So I'm a big fan of having a community lead. So someone who obviously is in charge of orchestrating your community team, someone who kind of can oversee the whole strategy, can talk to the C-suite if you're in a company and not maybe a membership organization, where they can kind of hold their own and explain the value of it and how it's going to work and what resources they need. Then you might have someone on like community content. Now, community content is really different from marketing content. So I probably wouldn't have those in the same role, which is semi-controversial, but I don't think it works that well. And I think people who focus on that community content do really well, and that content can be used for marketing, but it's a different type of content.
Is that just because marketing is more precisely focused on the commercial side, or what? Yeah.
Yeah, you've just kind of got different things. So like, for example, with the Lawview community that I'm building, we separated out the teams, and maybe it's good to give a tangible example, because what we realized between me, the community builder, and the marketing manager was our goals were complete antithesis of each other. And so we were kind of clashing on like short-term meets long-term incentives. And so we decided to separate them out. The content I was creating was to help the community members get more buy-in in their organizations. So it was explaining their journeys with their roles and almost like career development stuff and their ways of working. Whereas the marketing side, they were talking about features and products and how customers are using the specific feature or product. And the community members didn't want to hear about that. Over time, they probably will, but we sort of decided, well, actually, we're not going to talk about the product in the community. We'll let the community members talk about how they use technology, but we won't force it on them. And so I just think they can be quite different, but they can be aligned and leveraged together. So just to summarize, I think usually you'll have a community manager, probably a community lead, possibly an events person and a content person. It really does depend on what you're doing and what your set of activities are. There are community teams that have lots of community managers that look after different areas. So I would just sort of look at, what do you need to deliver? What are the skill sets required to deliver those things, and work backwards from there. And if you have anything more specific, I'm happy to take that offline and talk to you about it.
Cool. And Grant had a second follow-up question just around the comment around no silver bullet. Are there areas you would focus on to get the most, to get the train out of the station, just starting off?
Yeah, so on that, again, it depends. This is really where I think what your community wants and the mission that it's delivering on really becomes important. So for example, with landing pad webinars were one of our key areas to focus on, because we knew that we needed to democratize the information of how people learned about entrepreneurship and the key disciplines around building a business. And so that was really crucial there. I think for like maybe a beauty brand, short form social media posts, or even how Click Fitness is built up there, following around their fitness brand. They use like Insta Lives and a lot of stories. With InView for Lawview, we use a lot of blog posts and articles written about our community members, and that drives a lot of engagement. And we also created a fully published magazine, because we knew that lawyers spend all day redlining contracts in a screen. And so we actually wanted to give them a hard copy magazine to flip through in their own time, so they could actually get some joy out of reading. And so I think it goes back to, what does your community members want? Where are they? What type of people are they? And something that I really learned with building out communities of late is think more about where your community lives and what they view. And so, for example, for the lawyers, they read Bloomberg and HBR. So we created the community to be more in line with those things versus a traditional boring SaaS community, which is what they were used to with their industry associations. And that for us got people thinking that we have a really fresh perspective, and they love that, which is why they're joining the community now. And And so, yeah, just kind of go back to your members and look at all that stuff.
Very cool. Simone has hijacked Helen's instance. Hello, Simone, who's with Helen. Are you able to share some of the magic you have seen where community works as you've described it? That was my question, Simone, but great question.
John, do you want to describe that? I think you have a really great example of like those community dinners we used to do at, in San Francisco.
Yeah, so that was another sort of experiment of shorter form, getting people together, and actually to the point of the bicycle example, we actually started doing them in San Francisco and in the South Bay, because we realized that, you know, because of busyness and traffic and all these things, it was actually a bit of a mission to get that sort of 30 or 40 miles north to the city, parking and so forth. So some of those early community dinners, I think the best example that you're probably referring to is having a couple of people hear about it through other people in the community. So it was their first time experience of the community and subsequently joined, and literally sitting between, at that time, the head of Amazon AI for good, and a guy building drone technology that basically fueled itself in the air. And so one of Amazon's projects, which they just kicked off, which she was telling me about on the left, was a drone network protecting wildlife in Africa. And Dan on my right was, and one of the problems she was experiencing was basically how to keep this drone grid continuously monitoring the safari. And Dan had just basically got through his patent stage to deliver that solution. So I immediately left my chair, and those two came together, and there was a community match made in heaven.
Yeah, I think it doesn't really matter how much community strategy stuff you do and activities. Like the real magic is when people get together or you connect dots that weren't obvious, and just people talking to each other, really, and how you facilitate as much of that as possible. Community doesn't need to be complicated. And so I did a community build last year. It was for Catalyst Constellations, amazing ladies who have a really great business around essentially helping catalysts find a tribe, and also to sort of prevent burnout, in which are predominantly innovation managers inside corporations. And I talked to all of their community members, and they had a pretty strong community, and they just wanted to evolve it. And they had a book coming out, and they were really authentic, really great at what they do and how they did their coaching, and they really went pretty deep on a lot of the mental health stuff and whatnot. And I talked to their community members, and just the one thing I realized was that they got a lot of value out of the community, but they were all fundamentally lonely because their brains worked in such a different way from all of their peers and everyone that they were working with. And so I said to the ladies and the owners, and I said, I think you should do speed dating with your community once a month, and that can be one of your key activities. And I think it'll just completely fuel the community, that one activity, because that's what they want and it's what they're crying out for. And so they did that. And I think still to this day, it's one of their best activities, and their catalysts get a lot of value out of it. And so I think it's finding those things that just make the magic happen themselves. Yeah.
And that's the thing, isn't it, is that some things stick as your core, and then some things don't work, and then other things work at different times in the community build. Is that a fair sort of summary? Yeah,
totally. Even with InView for Lawview, I didn't know if it was going to work. I made it all up and got a fairly large budget to do it, which was kind of scary. And I had a thesis, and I worked towards that thesis, and I'd obviously done all of my research. And then I think, so going back to a magic moment, I found this random general counsel in Italy posting our content. And so I messaged him, and I was like, hey, like, who are you? And why are you posting our content? Like, it's a bit random. You're in Italy, we're not in Italy, blah, blah, blah. And he was like, oh, I just found it and I absolutely love it. It's just so fresh, and it like just gives me so much joy. It's like, okay, cool, weird, but great. And then so I got to know this guy really well, and he's become one of our community champions, and he loves all of our content. And I talk to him every sort of 3 weeks, which is actually quite a lot for, like a pretty high power lawyer. And he is just one of our biggest fans, but I found him because he was reading our content, which is really interesting. And so I think if you're doing the right thing, that, you should get the benefits out of it.
Very cool. Chitrang has a question here. Thank you, team, for the great session. Sian, do you have any thoughts around key considerations for community in a closed beta software as a service product? Started with Slack, inviting customers to a private channel. However, it's a work in progress.
Yeah, I think biggest thing there is, having that clear purpose statement. Why are they there? What are you hoping to achieve? Setting those expectations. If you're in Slack, you're going to need to figure out how to keep your engagement up. So are you going to do a few key activities every so often to keep people coming back to platform? And I would also substitute those sort of, Slack with conversations. And I wouldn't underestimate people's willingness to just jump on a call just because they want to chat about your particular thing. And so, yeah, I would, invite lots of people, actually let them talk to each other in a facilitated way. And if you're a bit nervous about that, because a lot of people are nervous about forums and whatnot, we could probably do a whole separate session on the community manager's role and, how to create engagement and also how to be a good moderator, because that's a large part of your job in firefighting. But yeah, having those conversations, letting them talk to each other. But if you have your one-to-one conversation before you let them into the forum, chances are that you know them better and you know how they're going to engage. And so you can kind of get ahead of anything that's about to happen.
Yeah, makes sense. Question from Finn, which is quite a nice follow-up to that, around some practical steps to actually promoting user-generated content and interaction. Yeah,
so the content has to be good is the first thing. And maybe not too self-promotional. Maybe, it has to fit in with that, creating value for your members and maybe your organization as well. And then something we do at Lawview, and we did at Landing Pad, was every time a community member posts something online, I make the entire business go like it and basically blow up their post so that they feel really loved. And they're like, oh, wow, that was great. I'm going to do that again. And that's really what you want. So always comment, always and if you have a bigger team or whatnot, you can go to their customer success manager and be like, hey, I noticed your portfolio company X did this. Next time you're having a conversation, maybe about the products, can you mention how cool it was or something like that?
Yeah, and it just reminds me of building my first software as a service startup, Sonar 6, and when we ended up with just over 2.3 million email addresses, and just that whole self-promotion versus, good, in our case, not user-generated content, but content that we thought deeply about what was on the minds of the community, that 2.3 million. And when we tracked opt-in and opt-out rates, we actually got down to a magic formula, which was one self-promotion or remotely self-promotion article or posting or piece of content for every four. So the other three had to be, really talking or connecting or curating the community. And we ran that, analytics every month. And if we changed that ratio, we saw a big change in opt-out and a big change in opt-in for the negative.
Yeah.
Max, g'day Max. He's got a question. Is extraversion a prerequisite to be good at community building? And do you have successful community builders who are introverts in real life? What a great question.
John's laughing at this question because I'm severely introverted, which is funny. And so I think over time I've gotten more extroverted, and I would say that I'm quite an extroverted community builder. But if you put me in a room when I'm not in that role, I'm pretty introverted. And so most of the community builders I know are actually pretty introverted people, but they love providing value and being there. And I think when you know a lot about certain topics, it makes you more comfortable as an introvert. And so I think it doesn't really matter whether you're introverted or extroverted. I think what matters is you caring about your community and being curious about it. And that's those, and maybe I think empathy is a really big prerequisite for being a community builder, because you really have to put yourself in the shoes of your community members, and you actually kind of have to just care about them as people and find them, if you're curious, you'll find what drives them and what they care about, and then you start caring about that too. And I think that makes you a better community builder. I think the one thing that's not good for community building is having an outrageous ego, because then it becomes less about the community and more about you. And I think that's where community doesn't necessarily make sense to me. And probably someone will debate me on that, but in my experience, I think ego is the antithesis of having a valuable community.
Kath and Kim syndrome. Look at me, look at me, look at me. Finn says, great preso, by the way. Sian, it's a very nice compliment. Thank you, Finn. David Bremner, g'day, David. We have an enterprise committee, community, I would say, or rather committee. God, hope you don't have any committees, but which we are only just resourced to manage. We also have inbound individuals, consumers who are also getting involved with questions. Any insight on how to encourage that, even when it doesn't fit our primary community? Well, that's an interesting one.
I think we should do a workshop, David. Shameless plug. But anyways, yeah, I would need a little bit more information on that, to be honest. But I do think that we're seeing a natural bridge kind of happen in the community world where you might have a customer community that's a segment of your overall larger community that might be more of an industry community. And I guess the question there is, where do you put them and how do you let them interact? And so, for example, with LawView, we have an industry community of which most people aren't customers of LawView. And then we're also building the customer community so customers can talk to each other and share best practice and tips and whatnot. And so I guess, you know, if their community is talking a lot around like, what software service should I get for my legal thing? Or, you know, like, should that have a place? And do we want to have advocates that are customers in that community? Probably. I don't know if that answers your question, but I would just find a space for those people if you think it's relevant. And if they're there, why not do something with them and maybe have a bit of a brainstorm around, well, sure, these people don't fit, but where can we put them and what can we do with them? And I don't know, could you do a roundtable with them, or could you do some other event or other content, or chuck them on an email list and nurture them in a different way? I think there's a whole bunch of stuff that you could probably do there.
I sense a proposal opportunity there. Another question from Grant. Very helpful, thanks. Seen some communities limit social posting to just a selected few, but the commenting and other aspects open to the community to respond. Can you achieve true community in this way? Interesting.
It feels like a can of worms to me. I don't know. I think, you know, anything's possible. If it works for people, it works for people. It does feel slightly self-interested. You maybe put in the chat around like what the community is and why they might be doing that kind of thing. I think if communities kind of just need to be able to snowball in their own way, I think. And if you try to control it so much, they're going to snowball somewhere else. And I think that's where the job of, and in this sort of forum setting, that's where the job of the community manager becomes more important in that moderation aspect. And, you know, I've worked with some of the best community managers in the world, and they're heavily trained in the art of moderation, but they're moderating, you know, communities that have hundreds of thousands or millions of members. And to this day, one of the biggest ways in which they de-escalate is just by taking the conversation offline, which is really fascinating. Not sure that answered your question, but I think in short, like the long-term sustainability of that community, maybe not, but if it's a support community and they only want, I don't know, to answer certain questions and they want that to be quite company driven, like that might be a way in which it might work.
Yeah, definitely a lot in that one. From Dean, really interesting, relevant subject. Thanks. His question: if my consumer-focused business landed on tough times and neglected the community, could the community then work against me? Crikey.
Sounds like a loaded question too. I think it could. It kind of depends. I think people, like, community is just a group of people, and so if you're a decent group, like, person to that group of people, like if you put yourself in their shoes, how would you want to be treated? And I think, you know, sometimes I screwed up at the landing pad and I would go back to people and be like, hey, I'm really sorry, I really fucked this up, like I won't do it again. And people were like, oh, thanks for telling us, like, good on you, like you're still learning, like we all are. And so I think that's maybe where transparency is really key, and letting them know. And you always have a few people that'll probably be irrationally angry at you or whatnot, but most people I think will be understanding if you kind of put yourself in their shoes, and maybe you could find something to do with them that, you know, might tide them over or something. I think the worst thing you could do would be ignore them and stay silent.
Yeah, I remember that one mistake you made, 2012, wasn't it?
I wasn't even working for you then.
Question from Rob. G'day, Rob. How do you manage community members who are joining to create commercial gain, i.e. Service providers, versus those that are there to gather knowledge and grow as an individual? Is there a balance or approaches that you recommend?
Yeah, I think so. I think this maybe comes back to your sort of, I don't know, community charter or your community purpose and your expectations of members. So that's where having really strong community guidelines comes in. And I also think have a community onboarding process. And I think part of that is if your community is there for people to pay it forward or to learn off each other, maybe you have a bit of a condition of like, well, it's fine if you're here for that. Like, great that you're transparent about that, but give value before you take value. And I think that's where that value exchange becomes so important is, you know, like this call, like it's probably quite obvious that maybe I might get some business out of this webinar, but that's not why I'm doing it. Like I just happen to be quite good at what I do, but the whole point is actually delivering value. And I think John and I both know that, you know, like something else might happen, but that's not really the point. So it's, or maybe it is the point. I think that transparency is really important. And if they're being a bad actor, just tell them, like ask them to maybe not be so spammy. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's kind of how I think about it. I think I kind of know your exact use case, and I think people should definitely provide more value than they're taking. And if they're not, then I would question whether or not they're acting in the best interests of the community.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, if I give an example for Territory 3, formerly Kiwi landing pad, you know, we face this challenge all the time. We get a lot of people approaching us to do webinars or want to be on webinars, and a lot of them just, you know, and quite openly commercial stuff. So our North Star in our community is our core founder group. So we have about 6,000 people in the community, but our core founder group's probably less than a couple of hundred. And we engage them directly. So we have, you know, lunches, got another one in Christchurch next week, in Wellington and Auckland when we can get back there and through the south. And we sort of listen, you know, basically in a non-formal note survey, just literally sit over the table from founders really growing fast and listen to their key issues. And then we collate that to where some of those more commercially oriented folks that we could have on will actually be useful to them and potentially actually end up being customers of them. So that's the way we curate that side of things as an example. Finn is asking how you think Web3 might impact digital communities.
I don't really have an opinion on any Web3 or crypto things right now. Sorry, team. So I'm going to ignore all of those questions. You can probably message me about it privately, but I could probably point you into some people who are doing a lot more work in that area than I am, which isn't helpful, but I think it's, you know, I haven't dived into that massively yet. And I think there's better people who are equipped to answer those sorts of questions.
Yeah, good answer. Helen, a reverse question. Here we go. I run a couple of communities in Christchurch, example, the Tech Marketers Group and Exec Women in Tech. Any thoughts on whether it's appropriate to try and monetize? Oh, I remember some of these conversations back in the day. I've had a couple of people suggesting I should.
Yeah, so I mean, sustainability in community is obviously a massive thing. You've got to figure out how to be sustainable over the long term. I think the most simplistic thing is if you're delivering value and you ask people to pay for it, will they pay for it? And if they won't, your job is to figure out why. And find a sustainable business model for that. I've watched it happen both successfully and not successfully. The Catalyst people, they weren't charging for their community in terms of membership model, but they started and they really figured out their membership tiers and what people got for very specific money. And they did it really successfully. I was actually really proud of them for doing it. And they were like, cool, you can pay this amount, you get this amount, you get this. And I just think you have to be really intentional with that. I think where it falls over is, I don't know, when you ask people for money and then you don't deliver on the value that you promise. And so I think maybe that's how you answer that question.
Cool. We've got about 5 minutes to run and still some questions to go. Sian, is there anything else you wanted to comment on? Because I feel like the questions will probably take us through to the end of the hour. And so I thought I'd just break and see whether there's anything else you wanted to chat on a free flow before we answer the other questions.
Not really, just happy to talk about anything. Obviously got a lot of tactical stuff. One thing I will say actually is it's still a depends thing, but if you're building a B2B community, I still think that the most important thing you can get is someone's email address. You need to have that relationship with that person. Some of the communities that I build, I have designed all these methods of capturing more information than just the email. And some of my most engaged community members read every single one of my emails, attend all my stuff, and I have no idea what they are, and their emails so ambiguous that I just can't find them on the internet, and I'm pretty good at sleuthing. But they're there all the time. And so my next step is, well, should I just email them and ask them what's up? And I think you can. And I would just say, like, don't be afraid to talk to your community members. Like, I think they love it. One of my champions the other day for one of my communities was just like, I have no friends in my career and I just moved to this new place. Like, do you have any people that I can meet? I was like, in a year, will you give me a testimonial that I gave you all your friends? He was like, yep. I was like, okay, good news for you. This particular location is where we have all of our community members in the world, like the biggest hub for it. So it's like, do you want to have the drinks? And he was like, yeah, sign me up. So I think that's kind of cool.
Friends away, it could be new business there.
Yeah, there you go.
David says, I'm not sure it's a question, right, enthusiasts interesting in making games could well work for a company who ends up signing up their company. I get that, yeah.
Yep.
Not sure that's a question per se, but that's the tail end of that last question. Richard Chu, g'day Chewy. It's a Web3 one, mate. I'm not sure.
Yeah, a 90 reunion in my last 24 hours.
We pass on that one just on the last, you haven't really done the Web3 stuff yet.
Yeah, so how do you find crypto Web3 community building mainly in Discord compared to other brands you work with? Most of them are building in Discord. Furthermore, what's the best way or tips to launch an unknown brand startup starting out? We coach quite a lot at this in the Female Founder Accelerator that I sort of co-run with my friend Kate. I think sharing what you're doing and just start talking and exist in the communities that they're in, you know, like I think, and talking to people, I think that's where it comes from. And like, it's no surprise, but the more people you talk to are the more people that know about your brand and startup, and make it authentic, but then kind of deliver some value back. So for example, with InView, we just started writing articles around in-house counsel and sharing their stories, and now we're one of the go-to places that they like to come to read that stuff, but we just kind of started from nothing. One thing I've learned as well that I don't know if I necessarily knew at Kiwi Landing Pad was the power of brand and community building, and I kind of alluded to it before, but if you build an epic brand that your community relates to and wants to be a part of, it will just make it so much more, like so much easier to build that community. And I mean like a brand that your community will love and get behind, and that kind of goes to being more in the world of your community versus the world of that you're in, which is a bit counterintuitive. But instead of, you know, being a, I don't know, legal software company that's, you know, teal and blue with your color scheme and a bit dry, like, you know, be the Bloomberg of legal. That's where your customers are. So, you know, like, yeah. And you can have sub-brands as well. So don't be afraid to have a sub-brand.
Very cool. 2 more questions in 2 minutes. So we're moving to wrap. It's been great. I think you win the prize for second most questions in a session that I've run this year. So yeah, it's great to.
Who beat me?
It's Vaughan Ferguson. I think he had like 26. But I mean, there's still 2 minutes to run. It's not an invitation for 10 more questions. Bernadette, hi Bernadette, great session. Thanks, Sian and John. You're welcome. How do you manage a disruptive community member who is there because your community challenges their business model? Oh, interesting question.
I would delete them from the community.
Easy.
I think it kind of comes back to like, people are people, and once they get through their anger, if you kind of go to them and just, if they're willing to have a conversation with you and you try to reach out to them and hear them out and explain what you're doing and how they can be a part of that, fair enough. If they're just there to be disruptive, then I would kind of reiterate the, your community guidelines, and that's why it's really important to have those so that people know that they're there. And it's pretty common that if people don't abide by their community guidelines, they unfortunately get asked to leave the community because they're not acting in the best interests of that community. But I would definitely invite you to try have a conversation with them first, because most people just, I don't know, are struggling or want help, and you might be able to help them, and that might in turn make them one of your biggest advocates.
Very cool answer, active listening. Last question from Kaylee Wilson, following up on Sian's mention of email addresses. Do you try to get business email addresses to better know who you're connecting with? And they're actually wrestling with this right now in terms of the pros and cons.
So semi-controversial answer, and it won't make me popular with the marketing managers, but it also depends on the community you're building. If you want to have a lifetime relationship with your community member, and the community is going to be around for a long time, I actually am a bit of a fan of getting their personal email address, because then you hold that relationship forever, regardless of whether or not they change jobs. And then I think what you can do if you need to, match the data in Salesforce, there's ways to do that, or, whatever CRM you're using. I think you want to find a way to capture enough information where you can triangulate. So if that's first name, last name, job title, or first name, last name, company, and then you can pretty much figure out who they are. And actually what I've been finding in some of the communities I've been building is people will sign up twice with their personal email and work email. But I think with all the modern tools out there now, if you've got people's information because they've given you a base level of information, you can use like Sales Navigator or Zoom Info to find their work email address if you need it to match that record in Salesforce, but they obviously elect which email they give you. And I think I think that should answer your question. And then David asked, so do you explicitly ask for the personal email or just email? I actually just asked for the email address, but we use a lot of LinkedIn. I use a lot of lead forms from LinkedIn, and a lot of people sign up for LinkedIn with their personal email address. And so they are able to put in whatever email they want. But I've sort of seen it as a benefit to have their personal email address. And also I think you could do other things, like should they sign up to your email list and also like your LinkedIn page, for example, or your Instagram and email, so that either way you've kind of got them in two different ways. That I think helps with your kind of continuity of relationship. If you are maybe don't have as forgiving of a CMO or a marketing person, I think, it's completely fine to ask them for their work email address, and you can put that in forms. And that's what a lot of companies do to build that marketing list for their community, and that's completely fine. I have a slightly different approach, but that's what Gainsight did. They had a really amazing marketing database. I think you just then have to account for your attrition when people move jobs. And I think, John and I used to giggle a little bit at the landing pad, because every time I'd send out the monthly newsletter, I'd be like, oh, these 5 corporates are going through a restructure, because I would get the bounces back, which maybe isn't appropriate, but it was a good kind of lens on life. Always
interesting. Sian Simpson, it's been a gem of an hour. Fantastic. We have so many questions from the community, and thanks, community, for all your chat expressions of thanks for having Sian on today. If you had someone that you think should have watched this that wasn't able to today, will be on our on demand in about 90 minutes on territory3.community and Territory 3 Academy. Sian Simpson, thank you so much. Great to see you as always. And thanks to the community. Tune in next week for our next webinar. Thanks everyone. Back, Edie.
Bye.